Harry and Meghan are leaving the palace to become financially independent. And you see, this is what happens when you bring the first black woman into the royal family. Yeah. She looked at Harry and she's like, "Nigga, you need to get a job. You need a job. You a grown-ass man. You can't still be living in your mama's house, Harry." What's funny is that no matter what job Prince Harry gets, you realize he's still gonna be Prince Harry, right? Can you imagine being his boss when he screws up? Like, what do you call him in and say? "Prince Harry, get in here, your majesty. You blew the Henderson account, my lord. Clean out your desk and may God save the Queen."
Welcome back to Clout Therapy, where we pull back the curtain on Hollywood's messiest moments. Today, we're diving into the exact joke that flipped Meghan Markle's image upside down. Trevor Noah dropped one line that had his audience roaring. But for Meghan and Harry, it was the start of something darker. Because after that night, comedy stopped treating them like royals and started treating them like a running gag. From late-night punchlines to viral memes and even South Park, the roast turned into a full-blown pylon. And the craziest part? Meghan's contradictions made the jokes even easier to write. So let's break it all down. The joke that started it, the backlash that followed, and why the laughter still hasn't stopped. If you live for celebrity chaos, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This is Clout Therapy. When Meghan and Harry announced in 2020 that they were leaving the royal family, the world was stunned. No one had ever seen anything like it. A prince and his new wife stepping down, giving up the titles, the palaces, the security, to live what they called a financially independent life. They weren't running away, they said. They were breaking free. And for a moment, it almost felt revolutionary. People across the globe rallied behind them. Headlines framed the couple as brave, misunderstood, even heroic. Meghan was painted as the outsider who couldn't fit into the rigid rules of the monarchy, and Harry was the husband willing to sacrifice everything to protect her. It was a love story wrapped in rebellion, and the world ate it up. Their interviews only added to the sympathy. Tearful sit-downs with Oprah, emotional speeches about pain, mental health, and survival. Meghan cast as the misunderstood victim of a cruel system, Harry as the protector who carried the weight of his mother's legacy. And for a while, that narrative worked. If you spoke out against them, you were brushed off. You were labeled jealous, bitter, or worse, accused of racism. The public line was clear. Meghan and Harry were victims. End of story. But here's the thing about a perfect story. It only works until someone pokes a hole in it. And in 2020, that someone was Trevor Noah. With just one joke, he flipped the script. What had been treated as sacred, untouchable, suddenly became fair game. Because once late-night comedy started laughing at Meghan and Harry, the whole world followed. This was no longer just about sympathy or victimhood. This was the moment the couple stopped being untouchable and started being punchlines. Trevor Noah wasn't just another late-night host cracking jokes to fill time. He came into Meghan and Harry's story with a background that made his voice different, sharper, harder to dismiss. Born in South Africa, Trevor grew up in a world defined by apartheid, racism, and colonial legacies that shaped every part of life. That experience gave him a perspective no British or American comic could match. While the UK press tiptoed around the monarchy, and US media often glamorized Meghan as a Hollywood princess, Trevor saw something else. He knew what it meant to live outside the system. He knew how power worked and how people used identity to gain sympathy or leverage. And that made his angle dangerous. He wasn't tied to the monarchy, so he didn't feel the need to protect it. But he also wasn't dazzled by celebrity, so he didn't bow to Meghan either. Instead, he stood in the middle, an outsider to both worlds, with the credibility to call out contradictions wherever he saw them. His immigrant story, his experience straddling cultures, gave him authority to speak on race and identity in a way others couldn't. When Trevor made a joke, it wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. It wasn't tabloid gossip. It was sharp, clever, and rooted in perspective. That's why when he aimed at Meghan, it landed. He could talk about her claims of racism, her narrative of being an outsider without sounding hateful or jealous. He could poke holes in the story without being accused of bias. Audiences didn't hear bitterness in his punchline. They heard truth, and that's what made it sting. Because Meghan had built a shield around herself. Any criticism could be brushed off as racism or envy or ignorance. But Trevor Noah slipped right past that shield. He had lived too much, seen too much, and earned too much respect to be dismissed that easily. So when he joked about Meghan and Harry, it wasn't just comedy, it was credibility cutting through. The audience roared with laughter, and in that moment, the narrative shifted. Meghan wasn't the untouchable victim anymore. She was the setup for a joke. And coming from Trevor Noah, the one comic who could say it without looking cruel, that was devastating. Because once he made it fair game to laugh, everyone else followed. Trevor Noah's first strike didn't come with a long setup or a brutal rant. It came with one perfectly crafted joke. The setup was simple. Meghan Markle had positioned herself as the first Black woman to enter the royal family. The outsider who broke through centuries of tradition only to be crushed by the weight of the crown. For months, that was the narrative. Meghan the victim, Meghan the survivor, Meghan the woman brave enough to speak out against an ancient institution. But Trevor flipped it. With that sly grin he's known for, he leaned in and dropped the line. Meghan wasn't the one being trapped. She was the one looking at Harry and saying, "My guy, you need to get a job." The audience erupted, and not with the kind of soft, safe chuckles you usually hear during a royal joke. This was sharper, louder. It had that edge of guilty laughter, the sound of people laughing at something they'd secretly thought but never dared to say out loud. For months, Meghan had been untouchable. If you criticized her, you risked being labeled cruel, jealous, or even racist. But here was Trevor Noah, flipping the entire race narrative on its head. Meghan wasn't framed as powerless anymore. She was the one calling the shots, the one yanking Harry out of the only life he knew, the one turning the fairy tale upside down. And that's why it stung. Because in one punchline, Trevor shifted the spotlight. The joke wasn't on the monarchy. It wasn't about Queen Elizabeth, or Charles, or the centuries of royal tradition. It was on Meghan. For the first time, the laughter wasn't aimed at the crown, it was aimed at her. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The air around her story changed. Sympathy started to curdle into skepticism. The woman who had been seen as a victim now looked like the driver, and Harry, well, he looked like the passenger who'd been told to clock in. That single moment became the crack in the armor. Because when Trevor Noah made people laugh at Meghan, not with her, but at her, it opened the floodgates. Comedians, satirists, even internet trolls saw that it could be done. The first strike had landed, and Meghan Markle's carefully built shield was never the same again. Trevor didn't stop at Meghan. He went straight for Harry, and the way he did it was humiliating. He painted this picture of a grown man, a literal prince of the United Kingdom, reduced to living in his mom's house with no real direction. The crowd laughed because it wasn't just funny, it was awkwardly true. Harry, the man who once represented the military, the monarchy, the future of the crown, suddenly looked like a guy who couldn't even figure out his next move. Then Trevor twisted it further, imagining Harry stepping into normal jobs. Picture it. Harry trying to work a 9 to 5, trying to fit in like everyone else. And then, inevitably, getting fired. The joke? His boss trying not to laugh, calling him "Your Majesty" as they hand him the pink slip. The audience roared, because in that moment, Harry wasn't royal anymore. He wasn't noble, or tragic, or even sympathetic. He was ridiculous. And that was the turning point. For the first time, Harry wasn't framed as the heroic husband who sacrificed everything for love, or the wounded son living in his mother's shadow. He was a sitcom character, the bumbling husband, the guy out of his depth. And standing right next to him in that mental image was Meghan, his co-star in the comedy sketch that their lives had suddenly become. What Trevor did in 2 minutes was more powerful than any tabloid headline. He rewrote Harry from Prince to punchline, and once people started laughing at that version of him, they never stopped. The reason Trevor Noah's roast cut so deep was simple. It wasn't tabloid cruelty, it was comedy. And comedy is almost impossible to fight. When a newspaper headline drags you, you can deny it, you can sue, you can call it biased. When an interviewer presses you, you can spin your story, flip the narrative back in your favor. But when a comedian makes a packed audience laugh at your contradictions, there's no defense, because you can't sit down on national television and say, "That wasn't funny." You can't argue with laughter. And Trevor knew that. His timing was razor sharp, his tone was light, but the message underneath was brutal. He didn't attack Meghan like a bitter critic. He exposed her contradictions in a way that made people feel in on the joke. And that's what made it so dangerous. Meghan's entire brand was built on controlling her story, on being the misunderstood outsider, the silenced woman who finally spoke her truth. But Trevor stripped that away in seconds. He made her look less like a victim and more like someone running the show. It wasn't a tabloid headline. It was truth, wrapped in laughter. And for the first time, people didn't just question Meghan, they laughed at her. That was the crack in the armor. And once it split, nothing could put it back together again. Trevor didn't just make jokes. He dismantled the strategy. He took the image Meghan and Harry had built and turned it into a comedy skit the world couldn't unsee. Trevor fired the first shot, but once the laughter hit, every other comedian smelled blood. Suddenly, Meghan and Harry weren't off limits anymore. They were prime material. Conan O'Brien took aim, joking that Harry looked less like a prince and more like a wax figure who had wandered out of Madame Tussauds. Saturday Night Live jumped in, turning the couple into clueless grifters who couldn't stop whining about privacy while begging for attention. Joe Rogan cracked jokes about Harry giving up palaces, guards, and centuries of tradition just to get bossed around in California. And in Britain, the comics went savage. Sharp one-liners about Meghan chasing Hollywood fame, Harry losing his dignity, and the monarchy quietly sighing in relief. The tone was no longer respectful, no longer cautious. It was open season, and audiences loved it because comedy had done what tabloids couldn't. It made Meghan and Harry funny. Clips started going viral. Edits of Trevor's original joke mashed up with Conan's, SNL skits stitched with Rogan's rants. The pylon became a chorus, and through it all, one thread connected everything. Trevor Noah made it safe. Before him, mocking Meghan felt cruel, even risky. After him, it felt inevitable. The first shot landed, and the rest of the comedy world brought the artillery. What started as one late-night joke turned into a worldwide roast, and it never really stopped. After Trevor Noah's roast, it wasn't just comedians taking shots. The internet exploded. TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. Suddenly, Meghan and Harry weren't untouchable royals. They were trending memes. Noah's "Harry needs a job" line became a whole format. People edited clips of Harry working as a cashier, Harry in a call center, Harry driving Uber with Meghan in the back seat giving him instructions. And the edits spread fast. Millions of views, endless stitches, people piling joke on top of joke. But it didn't stop there. Meghan's carefully staged lifestyle moments became meme gold. Remember the slow-motion pineapple cutting scene from their Netflix doc? The internet flipped it into parodies, splicing in laugh tracks, adding captions like "career highlight" or "peak productivity." glamorous shots of Meghan walking through gardens were turned into fake commercials for perfume or reality TV spoofs. YouTube creators made entire compilations mocking the way the couple spoke about privacy while filming every second of their lives. It was brutal. And here's the thing, once the internet gets hold of something, it never lets go. The memes keep recycling. The edits keep coming back every time Meghan and Harry pop up in the news. Narrator: once comedy unlocked the door, the internet kicked it wide open. The reason Trevor Noah's roast never died down wasn't just because it was funny. It was because it tapped into the biggest contradiction Meghan and Harry could never escape. On one hand, they demanded privacy. They said the spotlight nearly destroyed them. But on the other hand, they signed deals with Netflix and Spotify, filmed reality shows, gave bombshell interviews, and wrote books spilling every secret. They monetized the very thing they said they wanted to escape. And people noticed. That's why Trevor's comedy cut so deep. He didn't just tease Meghan, he spotlighted that gap between their words and their actions, the gap between their image and their reality. And that's why the laughter never stopped, because the joke wasn't really about one scandal or one headline. It was about the brand itself. Meghan and Harry built their public image on contradiction, and once Trevor called it out, the whole world realized it. That's why the roast kept living, reshaping into new memes, new jokes, new skits, because the problem wasn't just the monarchy. It wasn't just the tabloids. The problem was Meghan and Harry's story itself. Trevor Noah didn't just roast Meghan Markle, he changed the way the world laughed at her. Because once you've become a punchline, it doesn't stop. Every interview, every speech, every photo shoot becomes potential meme material. And for Meghan and Harry, that cycle isn't ending anytime soon. The laughter follows them everywhere. Narrator: and if you want to see just how savage the British comedians got after Noah lit the fuse, check out my breakdown right here. This is Clout Therapy. Hit subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.